Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be able to come and give a lecture and not have to get on an airplane to do so. So it took all of 5 minutes to walk from my lab. Well, I'm not going to talk about vesicular traffic today at all. I'm going to talk about what I actually spend most of my time on, which is managing a journal, but I'm going to put it in the context of a broader concern that really resonated with me maybe about 10 years ago when I took on the job of editor-in-chief of the proceedings of the PNAS. I saw as the journal of record in my field of biochemistry for now over a century, that it was losing out to largely commercial journals that were nurturing their business plan by using a number that you all know of called journal impact factor. And I saw what was a wonderful journal lose kind of market share, the PNAS losing market share to these commercial journals on the basis of what I consider to be a phony number. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about today. So I certainly am going to talk a little bit about open access, but I don't need to talk to you about that. You're all involved in that one way or another. But instead what I want to talk is more broadly about the problem that scholars, in my case in life sciences, have in publishing their most important work. So that is the subject of my talk. Now, probably just for review, I'm going to illustrate some of the differences in style of the various journals that life scientists favor. There, as you know, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know here, there are different formats for publication. There are subscription journals, there are open access journals, there are hybrids now. The print format is still very important, particularly for the commercial journals. I'll talk about that a little bit. They all obviously have online access, but increasingly, journals are headed in the direction of online only. In fact, I think I see that now, even for journals like Science, which has now started a spin-off called Science Advances, which is exclusively online and open access, and some of the Nature journals have done likewise. But print persists particularly for Nature and also Science because they insist, Nature for instance insists that their readers demand that the publications be in print. I don't think that's true, but they insist on it. I think it's actually their advertisers who insist on the print version because they feel that they won't have access to the markets unless it's in a print. And print, as you know and as I'll illustrate, severely limits the number of papers and the number of pages that can be published because, particularly for journals like Nature and Science, they have a pretty big print run, and it actually costs more money to publish more pages. And they will frankly admit that. And unfortunately, that influences the papers that they're willing to accept for publication. And it seems like an anachronism for the 21st century to be deciding what gets published on the basis of what you can print. There are, as you know, private commercial journals. They're very powerful. I would say at the very high end, they're increasing their market share by creating cascades of journals. So Nature or Science or Cell, if you don't get into the mainline journal, they'll transfer the reviews to one of their lesser journals and offer you virtually a free ride. But often you see as you move down the cascade of these series that they charge more and more for the privilege of publishing. So whereas publishing a main paper in a journal like Nature doesn't cost a lot, if you have to move down their own food chain, they end up charging something like $5,000 to publish in a journal like Nature Communications. Likewise, at Science, if you don't make it into the main journal and you get pushed off into Science Advances, it adds up to another $5,000. So, and this is profit for them. Science is not a commercial, it's not a private enterprise, but the money that they make for Science Magazine is used to sustain the efforts of the AAAS. So that's worthwhile, but you're paying for that. You're paying for it dearly. And then finally, there are, of course, a variety of editor types. There are professional editors who were trained in science. Most of them have PhDs. Many of them were postdoctoral fellows, and they've gone off in professional publishing. Many of them have very broad interests, but in certain instances, after having served for many years in these positions, I feel they lose track of what's going on in the laboratory. Many of the senior editors at Nature and Science have not been active in laboratory science for decades, and I think that limits their judgment. And then, of course, there are academic editors who are obviously part-time editors because they have an active professional interest in experimental or theoretical science. Well, open access has blossomed dramatically. It's grown and continues to grow. It's influenced the decisions of the commercial journals, and I think it's probably reasonable to expect that in the next decade or so, all journals will have open access. Whether it'll be gold standard open access or not, I can't say. But I think even journals like Nature are thinking about that for themselves. But I think the authors will pay dearly for open access of the main journals as they do with the lesser journals published by Nature and Science. And of course, open access, though it's powerful, is still only a fraction of the market in the life sciences. But I believe it's growing, and that's, I think, something that we can reasonably expect in the years ahead. I want to spend most of my time discussing what I consider are the problems with the peer review system, and as I said, problems associated with the use of this journal impact factor with which you're all familiar. So many young scientists see this as the course that they have to take when they want to get their work published, particularly in a very competitive journal. A journal like Nature or Science publishes fewer than 10% of the papers that are submitted. I think Science it's something like 6%, and Nature is something like 8%. And so they do this by looking for anything wrong with it, and they often extend the time that it takes to review an article by increasing the number of referees and sending them back and forth. It's not uncommon for a paper to be reviewed many times in cycles of review and rejection by these journals that can take a year or more. I recently met a fellow who said that he struggled for 4 years to get a paper published in Cell. Imagine the amount of time and money that's wasted in a vain effort to achieve this false sense of security publishing in what I've referred to as a luxury journal like that. So the peer review system really is broken because it imposes these demands on scientists to spend time and money when really what young scholars should be doing is thinking about the best way to get their work out to be seen by their peers, and not necessarily to be seen in these vanity journals like Cell, Nature, and Science. Well, many have complained about this. It's even been published in the very pages of these journals. Here, a senior immunologist, cell biology, Pluch at MIT, peer review of scientific papers in top journals is bogged down by unnecessary demands for extra lab work, argues Pluch. I wrote him when I saw this editorial, and I said, well, there's a simple solution, don't publish in Nature. He didn't respond. Our colleagues across the bay, Sandy Johnson, Peter Walter, and a colleague from Britain, Martin Raff. The stress associated with publishing experimental results can drain much of the joy of practicing science. Many of us have experienced this. We've all had the nasty remarks from referees. It often turns out it's that third referee who really is the evil guy who's screws us over. Some of you may have seen this. It's a picture that's taken from the last days of Hitler, and the German dialogue has been turned into English, talking about they've just received a rejection notice from some luxury journal, and Hitler finally calms down and he says, well, I guess we'll have to submit this to one of those damn open access journals. As I've indicated, part of the problem is the limitation of print, which really is kind of crazy. In the 21st century, to have decisions about what gets published based on what can be printed. That is ludicrous, and I think that will go away. But what has not shown any evidence of going away is a reliance on this ridiculous journal impact factor. Now, many of you are librarians and value that number. In fact, that's what it was created for. It was created by the Institute for Scientific Information for the express purpose of librarians to decide which journals to subscribe to. It's a reasonable calculation, although the number, as I'll indicate, is very flawed. Even for librarians, you ought to worry about using this number. But it's morphed into a number that is used to rate scholars for their individual contributions, an intention that was never in the minds of the people who came up with this number. And the journals that do well by it, of course, advertise it shamelessly. Here's Nature. We've all received their advertisements in sort of false bright lights. Now let's dissect the number a little bit. First of all, it really is quite remarkable how seemingly accurate the data is. The data is based on something called the Web of Science, which Thomson Reuters collects and does not share publicly. It's all privately held information. Those who've explored the database, who've had access to it, have said that it's really pretty dirty. It really can't be used to make calculations to 3 decimal places. It's just astonishing. So a group of editors, and I was part of this group, made an effort to reach out to Thomson Reuters to ask them how they calculate the number, why there are certain aspects of it that we wanted to question. We met in Philadelphia last December, and I asked one of the leaders of this group why this number is computed as an average. It's not computed as a median. It's computed as an average. And I'll show you some data later on, if you look at the distribution of citations over the 2-year window, which is this number is based on, you'll see that most of the citations cluster with a bell-shaped curve near 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, and then a long tail that goes off to the right, whose height is influenced by a minority of papers that are highly cited. And when you calculate that as an average, it distorts the number to much higher than it should be if you were to use the proper measure, which is a median. So I asked this leader of the effort why they used average instead of median. I was expecting some statistical answer that I wouldn't be able to understand, and she said, well, that's just always the way we've done it. And she said, and if we were to change now, it would be so disruptive, as though what they do now isn't disruptive. We also asked them why they calculated to 3 decimal places when the data aren't, and they honestly said, if we were to remove it by 1, 2, or 3 decimal places, there would be ties. Journals would be tied, and our customers don't like that. So it's giving you a false sense of accuracy that doesn't exist. We were hopeful that they might consider some reasonable changes, but in fact, they wrote us back several months later and they said, no, we won't. They've continued this advertising campaign. Most recently, it's taken almost a hilarious turn. Here is a pop-up ad in a most recent impact factor. What they do is they take their impact factor and they make an offer. They say, here's now our subscription rate for the year will be £41 or $41 or 41 euros based on their most recent calculation. In this case, the pop-up appeared on an article in Nature showing that Greek scientists were losing access to digital journals. Why were they losing access? Because they couldn't afford the subscription rate. They also had another pop-up ad. I have a slide. They had another pop-up ad that showed their number on an article saying that what was this one? Oh, it was an article decrying the use of impact factor in advertising journals. It was unbelievable. Well, it turns out that the editors of these journals, to a person, agree that impact factor is a false measure that should not be used to compute scholarship. One of them I shared a podium with provided me with this data, which is basically what I told you a few minutes ago. He had calculated the distribution of citations for a couple of nature journals and a neuroscience journal, and you see that if you were to compute median, the number for nature would be about twofold lower than it is, because much of the number based on an average is scattered to the right of this diagram. I am hopeful. This person said he was going to go once again to his marketing people and try to get them to change, because this Nature editor feels that he suffers as a result of this because people complain to him all the time about it. Well, it's not just that it's a false measure, but it has a toxic influence on scholarship. You may know, early last year, Nature published 2 papers claiming that human cells could be converted to embryonic stem cells by simply exposing them to low pH. I was watching the evening news that day when it came out, and there it was, right in the evening news on PBS. It was next morning in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal. It was an instant smash around the world. The link to the 2 papers was clicked 1.2 million times in the 2 months after it was published. But this was such a potentially revolutionary discovery that labs around the world started to try to repeat it. I mean, there are lots of stem cell labs around the world that would have loved to be able to do this rather than having to go to embryos. And of course, it turned out that it was not reproducible. Within months, it was clear that the data were manipulated, that some of the language was plagiarized. The young woman who was the first author on these 2 papers, although she returned to Japan as a conquering hero and was given wonderful laboratory at the research institute, was humiliated, drummed out of the business when the papers were retracted. A senior author who was her mentor at the Riken Institute in Japan was so humiliated that he committed suicide. I blame Nature in part for this. It's not, of course, Nature's fault that this young woman was guilty of plagiarism, guilty of manipulating the data, but the pressure that the journals put on people who feel that their career will not be made unless they can publish in one of these venues is so great, and is, I think, made worse by the publication policies of these journals, that they bear some responsibility for this and for the many other papers that they have to retract as a result of this pressure. Here's another distorting influence that came to light last year. This, I have a bunch of Chinese postdocs, so it's been translated for me. This is a bulletin published by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is basically a reward notice. It says, if you look at the column on the right, that if you win the lottery and you publish in Cell, Nature, Science, it doesn't matter what you published. If your name graces the pages of these journals, you get what is the equivalent of $33,000 for spending money, private, personal spending money. There are some scholars in China who are so successful at winning this game that they earn over half of their income by this kind of bribe. As offensive as this was, I was personally offended by the second line. Having been the editor of PNAS, I learned that it was only worth around $5,000. Well, all jokes aside, I think you can understand the concern if people feel that they can't have a job, if people feel that they can't have income unless they win the lottery and get into these journals that artificially restrict the number of papers and pages that they will accept, then surely you will cause people to, at the very least, hype their work, to misrepresent their work, to cut corners, and unfortunately to commit fraud. And I think this is a direct reflection of the publication policies of these prestige journals and their use of impact factor in selling themselves. All right, well, we can shout and complain about it, but there's at least something that can be done. And so a group of us several years ago got together in San Francisco to put a petition together. It's called the Declaration of Research Assessment. I hope you've all seen this. I hope you've signed it. I go around the world and I specifically speak to university administrators, university presidents, anybody that will listen, and tell them to go and look and to sign the DORA document and then to turn back to their institutions and develop other ways of evaluating scholarship other than using journal impact factor. Maybe actually read the papers. That's something we used to do. Well, not everyone agrees with this. I recently received a Twitter feed from a site that claims that Donald Trump is not going to actually be the president of the United States. Instead, he's being promoted as the possible successor to Francis Collins as the next director of the NIH. And this is a real tweet that was sent to me. Believe it or not, here it is. Huge news, NIH Director Trump. We won negotiations with Macmillan, all Nature journals to be rebranded Trump. All will be impact factor greater than 50. Suck it, Schekman. Okay. All right. Well, it's one thing to have a petition or to boycott. That may not have a big effect. But what I'm really spending most of my time doing is trying to nurture a new journal that we hope will appeal at the high end for great papers, but where the decisions will be made by active scholars and where we will not be limited by the number of pages or papers that we can publish because we're going to be exclusively online, and that is the journal ELife. ELife started now almost 5 years ago with an effort initially through Wellcome Trust and the Max Planck Society, and only later with Howard Hughes joining forces to change the way that scientific publication, at least in life sciences, may occur by the use of funds from these organizations to create a journal that would be run by active scientists. Indeed, it was the former CEO of the Wellcome Trust, Mark Wolpert, who now works for the British government, who said at a meeting on the East Coast 4.5 years ago that it was time for scholars to wrest control of the literature back to ourselves, where we would be making the judgments. And they asked if I would join them as the editor-in-chief, and I readily agreed because it really seemed like a unique opportunity to have these substantial, very influential organizations backing us with their considerable resources. And so we began with an effort to define a journal that may have a different way of handling papers and considering the best work. And so I'm going to, for those of you who may not know about this, I'm going to go through just a little bit about how we handle papers at ELife and how we think this may help make the process more transparent and more constructive. So let's just very briefly consider what happens typically when a scientist sends in a paper to a journal. Initially, of course, the journal goes in to journal headquarters. In the case of Science, Nature, and Cell, it's considered by one of the professional editors. And of course, I have to say, these people are in the business of selling magazines, and so I think that whether they admit it or not, this influences the kind of paper that they look for. At ELife, a paper comes in, and it's immediately given over to one of now nearly 30 senior editors who are all busy, active scholars, and that paper then is judged by that person in consultation with other scientists in the particular area, members of the larger editorial board, and a decision is made within a few days, ideally, about whether the paper should be reviewed. At this point, about 1/3 of the papers that we receive are submitted for full review. So the process, we will accept any format, it'll come in, and a decision will be made, and within a few days, the author is then asked to provide additional information if the paper is going to be fully reviewed. Then, if the paper is judged interesting and technically excellent, it's transferred to another member of the editorial board, in this case a very large group of reviewing editors. We have now about 250 such reviewing editors, very international group. And that person then, having already agreed that the paper is worth reviewing and thus having generally agreed that the work is technically excellent, that the work is conceptually novel, that person then usually selects two other experts who are not on the board. And the people, each of the three reviewers, reviews the paper independently. And that's more or less as in all journals. But then, and this is a little different, and I think has been a valuable addition, the reviewers have their reviews posted at the homepage of the particular article, not yet visible to the author. And the identity of the reviewers is shared. So the reviewers know that when going into this process, they're going to have to defend their remarks in front of their peers. These are people who are selected because of their expertise in a particular topic, and therefore they'll likely know the other individuals who've been selected. And they are asked in an online consultation session to discuss their comments and the paper back and forth over a day or more. Sometimes it goes on there's quite a lengthy discourse, and since I'm the editor-in-chief, I'm like a voyeur. I can go in and look at these conversations. And it really is very instructive to see the differences of opinions. I feel that this is very different than other journals. And I think it enforces some civility in the process, because in other journals, you can post your comments more or less anonymously to the other reviewers, and I think some people hide behind their anonymity. In this case, you can't hide. You know going into the process that you're going to have to defend your remarks in front of other people who may disagree with you. Anyway, this goes on. The discussion is led by the board member, who in about half of the time is also a referee, and then the conversation is rounded up, and in the case where a paper is going to be, it has been favorably reviewed by the referees, the board member assembles a list of recommendations to the author in two forms. One are essential revisions, and the other are minor optional revisions. And so the author gets a single letter, usually with just those comments and not necessarily all of the raw comments of the individual reviewers. The author is then given a couple of months to respond, and since the board member has led this consultation session and should be familiar with the views of the other referees, he or she is asked to make a unilateral decision when the paper comes back. And we urge these board members not to engage in multiple rounds of back and forth, which is really what takes so long with some of these other journals. And that generally is true. So we have then the single set of instructions, limited rounds of revision, and then the paper is accepted or not. If the paper is conceptually interesting but technically flawed, and that comes out during the review process, then it's rejected. And at this point, about half of the papers that are submitted for full review are encouraged for revision, and when that happens, the paper is almost always accepted after that. Okay, here is an example. This is just a contracted example that I've anonymized of the consultation session. Sometimes they go on quite a bit longer than this, back and forth. Often there's a resolution, not always. Sometimes there's a disagreement. But most often there is a resolution, and the final decision letter is vetted by the referees. And so another advantage of the system is that the referees, who are not on our editorial board, feel that they have they've invested themselves in the process, and they kind of own the decision. It's very different with other journals where it's the board member who owns the decision. In this case, the reviewers often feel that they've put so much extra time in that they have a hand in the decision. They have a direct hand. So how are we doing? I'm spending a lot of time because the submissions have been going up and up and up. On the top is the submissions. We have been publishing not quite 4 years, and we're going to hit 6,000 submissions this year. close to 600 a month now. The number of publications has been going up too, not quite as rapidly. How are we doing in terms of the model of trying to short circuit a lot of this back and forth? I think we're doing pretty well. ELife, the crucial number that we focus on is the time that it takes from submission to acceptance of the paper. And that's around 4 months now, which is pretty good because that includes the time that it takes for the author to do any additional work necessary to respond to the criticism of the reviewers. At Nature, that is much longer. At Cell, it is longer. At Science, it is a little bit longer. But in each of those cases, I think their numbers actually are much worse than that if you were to look at it accurately, because they often will reject a paper but encourage a resubmission, and this can go on over and over. And what they publish at the end of the day is the most recent submission date, not the first submission date. I've been tempted to go and do a survey of authors of the Nature, Cell, and Science papers to see when they actually first submitted the paper and then publish that information, but too many other things to do. Well, another way of looking, there are two measures that I look at to know if we're being successful, because we have from the very start indicated that we will not advertise impact factor. We don't feel it's a valid measure of the journal, and we don't wish to give it any credit. In fact, after a year of publications, we learned that Thomson Reuters was compiling data on us, and they were going to include us in their next survey of impact factors. Now, every other journal is asked to apply to have that measurement calculated. We did not apply, I can assure you. In fact, we wrote to them and asked them to cease and desist. We didn't want their number. We wanted to opt out of it. And they wrote back and said, it's public information and we'll do what we want. So we have had an impact factor imposed on us now for 2 years running, but I don't care what it is. I'm not going to tell you. I actually don't even know what the most recent one is. I really don't care. So how do we measure success? Well, there are two measures. They're kind of crude measures. One is the number of submissions. We're doing something right because we're getting a lot of submissions. But another is I ask the members of our editorial board to send us their best work. And I would say it's mixed. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them are waiting to see. Maybe they're waiting to see what our impact factor is. I hope not. But I've done a private survey to measure success, and I want to share with you the kind of thing that colleges do. You know, they look at their football teams, their athletic teams, and they're rated by how successful they are. And so we've done this too for ELife, and we've looked as of March of this year for which institutions have published more papers than anywhere else. And I'm proud to announce today that UC Berkeley has come out on top. It's not because I'm more lenient on my colleagues. The rejection rate is just as high, but I think we've been successful, at least in convincing our local colleagues that we're doing well, and I'm particularly pleased to see that Stanford is further down the list. Well, of course, I'm rounding up now. I'll just have one more thing to say. We feel that if we're going to compete at the highest level, we have to do so by being selective. We don't want to be ridiculously selective, but we have to be selective, which means that some papers are rejected and some people are quite upset when their papers are rejected. And most notably, 3 years ago, we had a review article submitted to us by the famous James Watson of double helix fame. It was reviewed, I read it, it was found wanting, we rejected it. Now, Watson doesn't go online too often, so it took him quite some weeks to learn that his paper had been rejected. And when he did, he called me up and berated me, and I said, well, we'd be willing to see a revised version. He said, no, it can't be revised. Every word is important. So we rejected it. And he did not take kindly to this. Ever since then, he's gone around complaining about me publicly. At the meeting of the American Association of Cancer Researchers 2 years ago, he made the following quote, I hate the editors of these journals more than I hate Republicans who use my name, James Watson. Now, here we are in Berkeley. You know, I don't know too many Republicans in Berkeley, so I took this as an affront, and wherever I present my sermon here, I challenge the scientists in the audience to do better than Jim Watson and send us their best work. Thank you for your attention.
Question up here.
Hello, Randy. I'm John Bohannon from Science. But I'm a reporter, so there's a church-state divide that is more real than you might expect. It's almost like a separate entity. But I did want you to make any comments, give any advice to science reporters, and maybe is there a distinction between these prestige journals that have, entire news departments like Science and Nature, unlike the other journals that are also impact factory?
Yeah. Well,
is there any value in it? Should they?
Yeah. Well,
are they different?
I'll make a few comments. First of all, although I have lumped science together with Nature and Cell, I will credit Science for having not only signed the DORA document, but they do not advertise impact factor anywhere. So that's great. That's good. And Science and Nature have the added value of having a staff of science writers who do important reporting on issues of scientific value that we're all eager to read. In fact, I believe that Science and Nature could do just as well if the subscription were limited to the front matter of the two journals and all of the research content were gold standard open access. I think actually Science is moving in that direction. Nature is not moving. Nature is moving in the opposite direction. So I see no reason why Science, to take an example, can't publish full-length articles online, exclusively online, with just a summary statement in the magazine. Really no reason whatsoever. When Bruce Alberts was the editor of Science, he argued that with the publisher, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. But they are now actually changing. They are, with Marcia McNutt, and whoever succeeds her, they are going in that direction. So there is value, and I believe that most people subscribe to Nature and Science for the front matter, and that they don't need to read Nature and Science, for those of you who haven't seen this, the papers that get published are basically postage stamps of the content of the paper. If you win the lottery and get a full-length paper published in Science, it gets gutted, and you're only left with a few thousand words, and all the content is moved to the supplement, to a supplementary section that's very difficult to read. I see no reason why Science couldn't put all the content fully developed online open access and just have the subscription model apply to the front matter. So I think there is value for scientific reporting, absolutely. And that's what Science and Nature do so well. So I'm referring just to the research content.
And what about our role as reporters we're kind of the pointy part of the stick in this impact factor effect. We're the kind of gatekeepers of what's sexy, ultimately. Are we doing a bad job by essentially making all the headlines, these papers that are published in this crucible?
Well, that's another question. I think, I have to be honest, my feeling is that when you have professional editors as the gatekeepers, who are being paid by the magazine to decide what gets published, that distorts what gets determined to be scholarship. And I think that, but it's a separate problem that scientists now are required to publicize their own work, there's too much of whether something is press worthy that goes into the decision about whether it gets published in one of these journals. You know, there's a lot of, I'll give you an example. There's so many of them. You know, here's another thing about impact factor. Many of the most important discoveries aren't recognized for years. And so if you measure impact factor over a 2-year period, you're ignoring some of the greatest discoveries. I'll give you an example. Last year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry, one of the winners is a guy named Eric Betzig, who discovered a new form of microscopy, palm. The theory behind that discovery was published in a journal called Optical Physics, and Betzig was proud to say that in the 15 years since that paper was published, it was only cited 100 times. You know, obviously didn't increase the impact factor of optical physics, and yet probably was their most important paper. So, you know, it's just, well, okay, you've heard me on this. So I think we shouldn't allow what, you know, generates buzz to decide what gets published in even the most selective journals.
So I think that the problem you're pointing to is bigger than impact factor, because I assume that it wouldn't make a difference to you if Nature and Science switched tomorrow to using H indices as the measure.
I think that's another phony number.
Right. So there's a problem here with these indices,
Yeah.
and with so what's the larger issue here? Is it
Yeah.
is it the oversexing of science,
Yeah.
or is
It's
it
the attempt to quantify.
is it the attempt to quantify,
creativity.
which is a weird thing for a scientist
Yeah.
to say, because I'm a
It
social
is.
scientist, right? Who's often resisting this
I love
over
numbers.
quantification
I
of
love
things.
numbers. I love numbers, but being reduced to a number is just, it's a false measurement. There have to be other ways that we can evaluate the creativity and influence of a scholar's work, and it has to. I think it has to be a narrative, and not a number.
I think it has to come from publishing less as well, because
Well,
the reasons a lot of the reasons people rely on these numbers is because they're
Yeah.
They say there's too much to review, there's
Yeah.
too much to read, there's
Well,
too
it's
many.
lazy. You know, it becomes a surrogate for the measurement of the value. You know, there are ways that one can evaluate scholarship that don't rely on a phony number, really. And so, I mean, there are lots of efforts to create numbers that are more meaningful, and you know, I can think of things that would be better, but I don't think we should, when we're hiring a young scholar in my department, or we're evaluating someone for promotion, at some level, somebody who's knowledgeable has to actually say why this scholarship is good. And I think there are ways of doing it. It used to be done that way. It's just become, you know, as you say, there's so much now. It's harder, so people get lazy.
I'm getting signals here. Can we take one more question?
So as a modest proposal from a librarian in the audience, how would you and the scholarly community feel if your library canceled the subscription to Thomson Reuters databases so you guys couldn't find out what your citation counts were or your impact factors were? Could you live without it? Could you live without the citation index?
I would toast you with champagne if you want. Go for it. Cancel those bastards, yeah.
Okay, on that note, let's thank our